Go right ahead.
Good afternoon, Council. Just wanted to bring one of our employees here to do a little presentation on the education that she's been going through and the recent certification that she's received from the International Right-of-Way Association. I'm trying to think of what that stood for. She's been working at this for a number of years here now, and just wanted to give her a little background into what it took and what this now enables her to for the county. So, if you come up here, Robin.
Good afternoon. I think most of you know my name. I'm Robin Glazier, and I represent Wheatland County as your land agent working on land-related activities. As Mike mentioned, I have been doing some education and upgrades. But first, before we get into the details and all those things, and forgive me, I have written this down. I typically wing it at these things, but I wanted to make sure that I said everything that I wanted to say here today. So first off, I want to say a big thank you to Council, to Dave and to Mike and to Alan for making the investment in me that has allowed me to complete the training that I've undertaken and to attain my certification as a certified right-of-way agent. As Mike mentioned, this certification has been completed through what is called the IRWA, acronym for the International Right-of-Way Association, an association and certification that's not widely known in Alberta, because typically in Alberta, because of the oil and gas activity, we have the land agent certification and licensing, which is something that is unique to Alberta, by the way, that was brought in to ensure that there was the ethical and fair treatment of landowners within that particular industry in those negotiations. The IRWA was actually founded in 1934, incorporated in 46, had office in California, has over 10,000 members worldwide, chapters in many Canadian locations, including Calgary and Edmonton. I've been a member since 2007, prior to my employment with the county. And in fact, I'll be attending their International Educational Conference, which this year is being held in Edmonton. Last year it was in Alaska, but due to timelines and things going on in my world, I was unable to attend that, which would have been kind of cool. So I get to go to Edmonton in June instead. I just completed the certification requirements. We applied for the final right-of-way agent certificate in March. I started the courses in May of 2016, completed the last one in January of 2018. And the courses completed included the following: Principles of Land Acquisition, both international. It was an international course. When I originally signed up for it in 2016, it was a massive course which included both American and Canadian standards and requirements and information. I think since then they've had some complaints, probably mostly from people not in Canada, that it included all of those other things. And so they've broken it into two different courses now. Principles of Real Estate Negotiation, Conflict Management, Principles of Real Estate Appraisal, Principles of Real Estate Engineering, and of course, possibly what is the most important portion of it all is Ethics in the Right-of-Way Professional, which is a requirement of anyone who attains certification through the association to redo every 5 years to ensure that you are reminding yourself of what the ethical requirements and standards are. Like any professional organization, you must live within these standards. This is not just while you're doing your work, but this is in every part of your life. It becomes, well, and I like to think that anybody working in public office, public work, has those as their morals and ethics and values in any event, because we are dealing with public, and it's very important that we're ethical. For those of you who don't know, I started working with Wheatland County in the fall of 2013, prior to which I was also working locally in a different local organization, similar to a county, but runs a lot of water all over the place. Upon my employment here, one of the conditions was that I complete the land agent training through Olds College. At that time, we were heading towards the land agent licensing, but a little more on that after. So I enrolled in that and completed the land agent certification training, which online, and I don't know if any of you know anyone who's actually done it through the online program. It's a 3-month program during which you complete the 2-year program. It's pretty busy, especially when you've just started a new job in a new organization. tends to build a lot of character, and you definitely need to apply yourself. But it was a great learning experience, and there are components of that training that are relevant to municipal work, but the majority of it is oil and gas. Once I completed that and got my final grades back, the next step to get your licensing completed is that you basically do a mentorship with licensed agents who look over your shoulder and make sure you're using the right forms, that you're following all the right regulations as set out in the oil and gas industry and all the provincial standards. Well, of course, our road use agreements and such don't really fall within any of those requirements. It's quite outside of it. So we quickly realized that that was not the correct certification process, and so that's when we switched gears to the IRWA, because I'd been a member of it for many years, and they had also changed some of how they did their certification. So that's where we went, and we have succeeded. So thank you again for your investment in me. I would like to say that I have my BA. I now have my right-of-way agent certification. I have the Olds College land agent course under me. As well, I have taken formal real estate appraisal training through the Appraisal Institute of Canada, through UBC while I was living there in BC for a couple of years. And hopefully, combined with my many years of experience working with land-related work and working in the area with the ratepayers in the area and other public organizations outside of this one and in other provinces, that all of this is giving me the knowledge and the confidence to work with the ratepayers, the co-workers and outside agencies to the best of my abilities, and your trust in me to do this and to manage this aspect of the business on behalf of Wheatland County. All of this gives me the ability to represent Wheatland County in a knowledgeable and professional manner, and I thank you. And I thank you for your time today to indulge me to share all this with you. Looking forward to a few more years of continued employment here. Thanks.
Thank you, Robin. Congratulations. Okay. Okay. And I believe our 2 o'clock is here for the Alberta Health Services presentation. Yeah, just please use the podium and turn the mic on.
Good afternoon, everyone. What are we? Slides not up?
Oh, it's over here. Okay.
Don't need it there? Okay. So you can see there. Great. Thanks. So my name is Jason Saba. I'm a public health physician and one of the medical officers of health for AHS in Calgary Zone. And this is Michelle Fry, who's a program consultant also with AHS with addiction prevention. And so thanks for the opportunity to come here today and talk to you about cannabis legalization and the health issues associated with it. It's a very complex process, this legalization, as I'm sure you know, and there are a lot of issues for each level of jurisdiction to be thinking about. So we've prepared an overview presentation that has gone again from, oh, you're trying to fix it. I'll just keep going. But basically, we're going to quickly cover the legalization at the federal and provincial levels, where things are at in terms of that process, if that's something that we can help familiarize you with. Talk about what we mean by the public health approach to legalization, have a brief review of the evidence and the research, and then go over the AHS recommendations for municipal bylaw development. And then obviously we can't cover nearly everything in the amount of time we have today, so we have some resources to leave with you, and happy to answer any questions now or in follow-up as you work through any issues related to it. So I'll turn things over to Michelle for the first part here.
Sure. So as just some general history, it was announced in April 2017, as many of you are likely aware, that legalization was projected for July 1st of 2018. Throughout the fall, we saw Bill 26 move through the Alberta legislature and pass third reading. We are also expecting a third reading through the Senate federally, anticipated for some time in June. And then that means likely an 8 to 12-week cascade for that newly anticipated federal implementation date. So just as, oh, was there a question, sorry? Oh, sorry. So just for some points for terminology, we've outlined what consists of the word cannabis. Marijuana is a term that is used to describe the leaves and flowers from the plant. And oils are also part, the white, also you'll see the white for the schematic is what will be legalized in the first round of legalization. So it'll include the dried flowers, leaves, and oils under 30% THC. And then part 2 would be edibles that would be purchased in like a package, so to speak. So you could still make your own edibles with this initial round if you were purchasing and using the oil. So the overall intent for proposed legalization is to reduce youth access, protect young people, deter and reduce criminal activity, strictly regulate the product itself, protect public health, enhance public awareness of the health risks, and provide an opportunity for legalized production of cannabis. And the current program for medical cannabis will continue as is. So in Alberta, our Alberta Cannabis Framework covers a number of items here. So we've set minimum age following the federal age of 18. AGLC is going to oversee safeguards for sales as well as distribution. In Alberta, we'll see storefront, private storefronts, much like we see with liquor stores, as well as online sales administered by AGLC. In the Alberta framework, it allows for public consumption. It allows for 4 plants per household following the federal framework, as well as indoor and outdoor growing. There's a 30 gram per transaction of purchase limit. And there's also a 5 gram threshold that's been outlined for those who are found with cannabis. And what that 5 gram threshold means is a threshold for criminal and non-criminal charges. So if a youth under the age of 18 was found with cannabis in their possession, if it was under 5 grams, it would be confiscated, they'd be ticketed, and brought home to mom or dad or their caregiver. And over 18, or sorry, over the 5 grams, that threshold will follow the framework that we see currently. Yeah. Yeah. What is 5 grams? Yeah, that's a really good question. What the 30 grams, what we see is usually about a pack and a half of cigarettes. Or one of those little bags that you can, if you think, has anyone seen David's Tea, those sort of Ziploc bags? So that's what a 30 gram package is going to, has been produced in, by the federal government to sort of look like. That's what I think it looks like. But 5 grams it depends on the size of the joint. If that's what we're talking about, but it would be approximately, 2 to 4 joints, depending on the size of the joint. And so it's hard to give a definitive answer because a lot of it will be sold as just loose product. But yeah, that would be part of a public education approach for sure.
So you're saying 4 to 5 joints, somebody under 18?
They would receive a ticket, much like if they were found with alcohol, but they wouldn't receive criminal charges. Yeah. Yeah.
I trust that you know somebody that's had that.
There's also been some regulation in Bill 26 around drug-impaired driving. More details will be filled in once that comes out from the federal level this spring. we expect this spring more information about impairment in the workplace and workplace legislation. And there'll be more information coming soon about the advertising and packaging restrictions as well. So some jurisdictional responsibilities, and just for time, because this is in everybody's package, municipalities can be responsible for education, taxation, retail location and rules, as well as public consumption, and land use and zoning. And it outlines a number of the items from possession limits to trafficking, and you can see here everything that's outlined both federally and provincially as well, and there are some areas where there is overlap for obvious reasons. So with the public health approach, here, let me just find my notes, sorry, I skipped ahead a little. Well, AHS recognizes that cannabis is different from alcohol and tobacco. There are many lessons learned from dealing with the harms related to these two substances that can apply to cannabis regulation. And having strict regulations is important for reducing the health and the social problems over time in our communities. And this is the goal of the public health approach. And as you can see here, we've outlined a couple of other substances, both tobacco and alcohol. And with cannabis, we're looking for the bottom end of the curve. And it's important to note that taking a public health approach to cannabis legalization that includes market regulation, strict market regulation, does not eliminate all health and social harms. But it does the best possible way of allowing access and minimizing the harms, the health and social harms. So now we'll talk a little bit about the research. And there was a review of 10,000 studies by McCormick et al. In 2017. And the review found that conclusive evidence regarding the short and long-term impacts of cannabis use remains elusive. And there's a number of reasons for this, and a lot of it is embedded in some of the research challenges around developing research related to cannabis, particularly around regulations. So it remained a Schedule II drug, so there's issues related to that in receiving both funding and ethics approval to provide research, to conduct research. Around access, there's issues embedded in the research about accessing the same type and quality and type of cannabis. So a research study may have included use that talked about combustion as well as edibles, and there's issues in the knowledge that's gained as a result of that study design. Methodology in terms of the hierarchy of knowledge. So a lot of the research out there is around, it hasn't reached levels of trials. A lot of it is observational at this point. The time to develop knowledge is also important because in ideal settings, you can develop new knowledge in about 15 years, but in traditional modes of research, sometimes it takes 25 years. So the time horizon is quite broad. As well as there's a lack of surveillance, and that's an area that Alberta Health Services and Alberta Health and Health Canada is quite focused on, is setting this up for success to get the most meaningful surveillance in coming days following legalization. So there's two key reviews that Alberta Health Services has based a lot of our evidence on, and both are, one comes from the University of Calgary, the Health Technology Assessment Unit, and another from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And I mentioned the green one in my previous slide already, and in this review, it ranked 10,000 studies for quality, and it ranked them as insufficient, limited, moderate, substantial, and conclusive. And in brief, I think I've already mentioned this, it found that conclusive evidence regarding the short and long-term impacts of cannabis use remains elusive. So overall, the substantial evidence found health risks related to cannabis use included development of schizophrenia and other psychosis in those with genetic and biological liability, increased risk of motor vehicle crashes, low birth weight in offspring, respiratory symptoms with long-term use, problematic use patterns, and cannabis use disorder in early onset and heavy use, and an increased likelihood of use in males and those who use tobacco. So those are the areas, like we've highlighted here, that have substantial evidence, but for the most part, a lot of the research has yet to reach that conclusive level yet. In the University of Calgary review from the Health Technology Assessment, I'll go over a little bit of the areas of evidence of harm, but this is in your package for further review if you care to refer back. But in areas where there was evidence of harm, overall, where it included areas of such as driving, stroke, pulmonary function, cross-interaction with drugs, vision, regarding mental health included psychosis, mania, neurological soft signs, relapse in patients with psychosis or schizophrenia, and as well as dependency of cannabis. In terms of cancer, there was evidence of harm around testicular cancer, as well as in social effects around impaired driving. There's also evidence around brain changes, neurocognitive changes, and harms associated with use during pregnancy. So another paper that came, a review that came out of the University of Calgary around secondhand cannabis exposure found that secondhand cannabis smoke, sorry, this one did not come, yes it did, sorry. Secondhand smoke is more mutagenic and cytotoxic than tobacco smoke. And in a 2017 study that looked at secondhand smoke exposure, it found that levels of impairment existed 4 to 8 hours of exposure to secondhand smoke, hitting the thresholds we see here in blood and urine samples. And this was found when exposure was in an unventilated space for approximately 15 minutes. So an example of that would be like in a small room or in a vehicle, for example. So that has some significant implications for children, as well as people who are exposed and maybe driving a vehicle or have certain fit for work requirements for their occupation. But what is clear is that what we know for sure is that in cannabis is not a benign drug, and that there are risks and harms associated with its use. But there potentially can be some benefits to some individuals as well. But all that being said, the how and the why is not clearly understood yet, and it is early days. I'm gonna pass it over to Dr. Spy.
Well, I'm sure they knew all of this before they implemented it.
I think they knew, yeah, they knew what they were getting into, or most of it anyway. So,
It's safe now. At 30 years getting rid of cigarettes and all the effects of the smoke, then we're bringing something else in that's worse.
well, I think that's the next part we want to touch on, because it is two messages. The surveys have shown people underestimate the impacts of cannabis from a health perspective, but then also in the next part here, we're going to touch on the relative relationship to some of the other substances that are legal and not legal. So that's a good point. Good segue. Thank you for that. We do know, one of the things we do know is that cannabis is already one of the most common, or is the most commonly used illicit drug in Canada. According to the Canadian Centre for Substance Use, 40% of Canadians have used cannabis, 10% have used in the past year, 20% of 15 to 24-year-olds have used in the past year. So there's a particular focus on youth and thinking about their current rates of use with cannabis not being legal. But then also knowing that 70% of current users are adults. So there's both of those pieces to the puzzle and thinking about the high rates amongst youth and then overall burden amongst adults potentially. The Alberta context is quite similar to the national one, as you can see on the slide, with about 50% of Albertans having used in their lifetime. A really significant proportion initiated use between the ages of 10 and 24, and of that, a majority between age 15 and 19. But that is an important piece to keep in mind, I think, with legalization, is just the current state of where things are at, even under a prohibition framework, that Canada globally has a very, very high rate of cannabis use, and I think that influenced the policy decisions. So this graph just provides a bit further breakdown in terms of the prevalence of use in youth in Canada, with the Canadian children in blue and Alberta in green. This further breaks it down into every use, past year use, past 30-day, and daily use. And obviously those latter categories are more significant in terms of the risks associated. It's quite a different potential for harms related to using daily relative to very infrequently. How will this change when cannabis is legalized? We don't really know. There's a variety of perspectives on that. From the National Cannabis Survey, that results that just came out, 20% of respondents indicated they would increase consumption or try new products with legalization. But only 6% who do not use regularly indicated some intent to increase or try new products. So the jury's still out, and that leads into some of the recommendations we're making in a few slides. I think this slide also makes a really important point and picks up on some of the things Michelle mentioned, that since between 2008 and 2015, substance use in Alberta teens in grade 7 to 12 really decreased. As you can see, with the blue plot for overall alcohol use, going down from 50 to 31%, binge drinking from 38 to 17, and cannabis use from 19 to 11%. So this sort of provides some of the rationale for when we're worried about renormalization of smoking or normalization of cannabis use broadly, that these are some of the really significant health improvements that we would be at risk of jeopardizing.
That drop, like, reason why they think that those rates have dropped?
It's a good question. I think there's a lot of factors involved, and we don't know for sure. We like to think some of the policy interventions and things we're doing in public health make a difference, and there's some sort of just changes in social norms and other factors that fluctuate. But certainly there does seem to be a trend, and tobacco's not up there, but tobacco as well. And so hopefully that is a trend that would continue. You never know over time, but that's certainly where we're hoping to continue from a public health perspective. One caveat that people are probably aware of is cannabis has become quite a bit more potent over the years, and particularly the concentration of THC, or the psychoactive component. Changes in growing methods and selective plant breeding and other factors have resulted in that. But as you can see on the screen, about a 60-fold increase in Washington from 2000 to now, to 20 years later with legalization there. So that ties back into the evidence that a lot of the issues that were studied historically, things have changed, and conclusions may not be as valid. So very much need to study things in the current context. This now gets back to the point that you were raising about the relative ranking of cannabis in terms of substance use and the potential harms. This is looking at it from an individual perspective. So for a user of cannabis, the harms to themselves in red and others around them in blue, cannabis midway down there below alcohol and heroin at the top, certainly with the opioid crisis going on right now. I think people are probably familiar with that. Below tobacco as well at the individual level. And then, of course, this is a population level perspective. Tobacco and alcohol are really the big significant issues, and have been. And that ties back into this point here is we certainly think about cannabis impacts in relation from a public health perspective to all substance use. But we do have a unique opportunity right now with cannabis legalization to maybe get some things right that we didn't with alcohol and tobacco. And provide that settling point there at the bottom of the curve to the best of our abilities in trying to minimize harms as we can. So and I won't go into this slide, there's more detail in the packages if anyone wants to refer to this, but when we're thinking about public health, sometimes there are a variety of perspectives on what should be done, and that's because people have a different focus in terms of the multiple priorities and goals from a public health perspective, from minimizing harms to protecting safety and thinking about impaired driving and that type of thing, thinking about providing services to people who have high risk problematic use, and always addressing determinants of health and health equity and making sure we're not inadvertently impacting some people more than others. So the recommendations that that AHS has put together try to take into account all of those factors and build on work that's been done by the chief medical officers of health in Canada and others to try to take our best guess at what an approach might be and how we can help municipalities in their approach to cannabis, and start conservatively, start slow, given the state of uncertainty, and then react as we get new evidence is the general message from the information package. So I'll go through a few of them, and I don't know if people have had a chance to look. I believe they were sent out in February from our office to all municipalities. If people have seen this before, some of this might be review. We're also certainly recognizing that some of it may not be applicable in all situations, so I think it's more of a menu that you can look at and decide what's relevant in helping you shape your policy approach to this issue. So there's two reasons why we're recommending starting with caution. One is that, as we've mentioned, there's little reliable and conclusive evidence to say what safe cannabis use looks like at a population level and for individuals. But we do know, again, from the experience with commercialization of alcohol and tobacco, that missing that mark does result in a lot of harms. And also it's easier, and this has been recommended by a number of expert groups, that it's easier to start with a more restrictive approach and then roll it back than it is to actually add more regulations down the road. So that's the initial justification for the overall approach. AHS does recommend that municipalities ban public consumption, implement regulations to do so. And again, the rationale is twofold: that cannabis is an intoxicating substance and makes sense to treat it similarly to alcohol. And then, as Michelle mentioned, the potential for harms related to second and third hand smoke. And that was the approach that the US jurisdictions that have legalized have taken. They've really been restrictive around public consumption. And if you've been following in Alberta, there's been, Edmonton and Calgary both seem to be planning to do that from an urban perspective. Recommendations around multi-use housing. There's certainly some debate around this and questions around equity and access, but both Health Canada and AHS do have that recommendation that it does make sense to ban combustible consumption in multi-use housing. And just the key point to flag is that our environmental health group isn't in a position to respond to the anticipated number of nuisance complaints if smoking cannabis is allowed in those contexts. So there could be some resource issues that would be worth considering for people if they don't go with that approach. Yep.
How harmful is that in relation to spark out in the atmosphere? A lot more dangerous for them.
Yeah, enclosed spaces without adequate ventilation certainly are a concern, both from more of a concern.
Parks and big playgrounds where we're not dealing with it.
Yeah.
Why are we dealing with it at home?
Yeah. It's kind of the variety of rationales that feed into it. The general public consumption bans focusing somewhat on the exposure to second and third hand smoke, but you're right, in open environments, really the argument there is more around the normalization issue, and just especially for vulnerable groups and children being exposed to people smoking and it rolling back some of those gains. So very similar to tobacco smoking and the arguments for being more restrictive around that in public spaces.
When I go to smoke on there, you can smell pot all around, but you can't smoke a cigarette.
Yeah.
Now you're saying I don't have to smell pot this year when I go to close the
That's to be determined. They tabled that one in their administration, and the city's working on that.
Can't smoke, and if you put a cigarette and they got you like that, right?
Yeah.
It's enforceable.
Yeah.
With the marijuana, you can
And I think that's, I mean, that's a challenging issue in terms of how much enforcement there is of whatever approaches are put into place. And
municipalities, so that a province.
they are, yes, leaving some of this to municipalities. That's,
All of it, because I mean, they're saying, that's all municipality areas.
okay.
All forms of smoking in public spaces. Public space is everything.
Yeah.
That's everything outside that door.
Well, I think,
On the highway, that's public space. I know.
well, I think that's up to each jurisdiction to define what is and is not included in that. And as I said, this is the general recommendations that we're putting forward may make sense in some jurisdictions and not others. So Calgary's perspective might be quite different than yours, for instance, and you'd have to think about that. I think, to me, the main point that I would want to be making with this recommendation is thinking about it similarly to tobacco smoking, in terms of that normalization risk, and thinking about it similarly to alcohol in terms of a public intoxication risk. And you've probably thought about these issues before. And so in some cases, cannabis is new, and in some cases, it makes sense to think about it in terms of the established approaches to other substances that we've been experiencing and dealing with for some time. Right. Yeah.
Perhaps from marijuana or cannabis is smoked in a home. 5-year-old child is there inhaling that.
Yeah.
If I have a beer at the dinner table,
Yeah.
from the social aspect,
Yeah. Well, I think that,
there is a big distinction in that.
yeah, and I think so in terms of private homes, people are able to, you know, there's, you know, we don't restrict tobacco smoking in some places in society, and we do in others. It's really moving some cases at the state of readiness, but the obligations we have are in thinking about where other people can be exposed. So that's the multi-unit housing as a particular place where this can come up and be a challenging issue to address because of that potential for smoke to move through the ventilation systems. And it really, though, I mean, part of this is challenging to predict because of the sequencing and edibles not being on the table yet. We really don't know how significant access to and issues related to combustible intake of cannabis are going to be, right? And how much felt need there's going to be for that. And we'll see. But that's the reality right now, that we don't have that information, and the first phase of legalization does put us in this position to think about which trade-offs make the most sense, and where to think about it like tobacco, where to think about it like alcohol, and where to think about it like it's something new.
Province doing to protect our children.
In which homes, sorry? Yeah.
And just to answer your question, though, I think that there'll also be public education and safe use, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well, in terms of what safer use or lower risk use looks like, and that's to come with a lot of the public education. Many ways to consume cannabis, and in addition to just smoking it and secondhand smoke exposure, there'll also have to be some safeguards around storage of cannabis. That's something we've seen in Denver with increase in poisoning. But that's another tangent, but it sort of takes you.
Is there any, yeah, but I mean, it's unfortunate because the 3-year-old.
For sure.
Do we have an idea, or is there any idea?
You have stats.
I don't have stats on that. I think we'll find out soon with sales. People who smoke it like to smoke it because the high is immediate, but there's many other ways and lots of other products in natural health products. Like it can be in a cream, you can rub it on your skin. You know, there's lots of different food. It's in beverages. You can make teas. There'll be cannabis infused beverages. But those aren't on the table with those manufactured edibles as of yet. So there's still a phase 2 with legalization coming, and right now, like that one of the first slides, it'll be mostly around combustibles and then oils that you can make yourself.
And that
Your own
is,
product, yeah.
I think some of the edible products that have been available in other jurisdictions, that's something that's going to be really thought out in the next round, and things like gummy bears and things that are very desirable to youth, probably looking at restricting some of those as part of the process.
Are you going to be allowed to, let's say, have a smoking area? And are you allowed to say you can smoke here, but you can't smoke cannabis here? Is it going to be a restriction? Can we do that legally?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
that's up to the
The owner
municipalities and local.
or public owner?
Yeah, yeah. The city of Calgary is thinking about that with, as you mentioned, the festivals and the approach to whether there does make sense for there to be a designated area for special events, or whether that's counterproductive, and we won't get into that one, maybe unless there's questions, but.
Oh, Chris left. Dean, you might be able to answer this, but from our perspective, as like RCMP, likely don't have the resources to enforce this. If our peace officers go out there, I don't know what we can do. We can't deal with the criminal code offense, so if they've got over that, was it 30 grams, I think it was, we have to call in the RCMP, would we not, Dean? Or, yeah, so Calgary's a little different. They have their own police force, and they have criminal code capabilities to enforce that, I believe, right, Dean? Yes. Yes. So as a jurisdiction as ours, we can't follow through on a police service because we don't have that capability.
Can't we take everything away with 30 grand and set up our own shop here?
Yeah, we'll talk after the meeting.
Entrepreneurial. So,
If there's more questions about the justice side of things, we can collect those and put them forward to the Secretariat, or provide you with a contact to answer more.
Well, I don't know about council, but my feeling is the federal and the provincial government need to protect our children in their homes. Because they can't, a 3-year-old cannot protect themselves, and that's all I'm going to say.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but is cannabis not being rolled into the Gaming and Liquor Act? So do you know whether or not there's going to be a section in there pertaining to alcohol right now?
Yeah.
There's no public consumption. If this is rolled into the Gaming and Liquor Act and there is no public consumption, then we as peace officers can deal with that. Best authority under for liquor, and I suspect that it's probably going to be the same with cannabis as well.
Comment on that?
So that's a really good question. I mean, we're public health, so not justice, but in the Alberta Cannabis Framework, it does allow for public consumption, but you are right, in the legislation around public intoxication, it also describes that public intoxication is not. So not being a lawyer and not being someone from justice to answer that, it'd be beyond, I think, our scope for what that nuance is.
wouldn't you put them all in the same store and just sell them all through one gate rather than?
And this is, again, I think, one of the places where, depending on the context you're making decisions in, some of these things may or may not make sense. In a rural location, there maybe can be some arguments around that. In the general rationale, though, is that if they're co-located, there's going to be more likelihood of co-use. And we have good evidence that that, at a population level, can occur, and there can be more harms from the use of both of those substances together. So it's sort of the convenience access factor, right? People that are very determined to use are going to use. People that are going to there and you're like, you go to the counter at the convenience store and buy whatever's right there. There's some argument to that, and some evidence from the addictions world that is a plausible risk with that. So
Setbacks are only, what, 100 feet? You're going to get into that later on.
yeah, I mean, we can talk about that right now. Yeah.
That's not, to me, that's not a rational reason.
So bringing up the issue of setbacks, AHS is recommending that municipalities consider limiting the number of stores or implementing density and distance controls to keep them from clustering too much. And certainly in some areas, the initial interest in opening retail stores has been quite substantial. And as you mentioned, the recommendation not to co-locate. Consider requirements for some education and community engagement as a part of the development process. And this is something that Denver had done, may or may not make sense in a given context. Limiting hours of operation is one that I'll touch on the following slide. And then restricting signage and advertising to minimize visibility to youth is another measure that can be considered. So these are the setback distances that AHS is recommending. In thinking about distances between outlets, distances between other institutions such as schools, childcare facilities, and then in some cases a density restriction as well as being measures that could contribute to managing the number of retail outlets. So we've seen in Alberta a variety of approaches to this point, and some that are going roughly with this approach and others that have gone in different directions. But these are as I said, the general sort of menu of recommendations that AHS is suggesting be considered. And getting back to the point about the AGLC role, they're clear that in this case that they aren't going to play a role in restricting the number of stores, the locations, and that is a municipal responsibility to do based on their local circumstances. And then here, just lastly, in terms of my section on hours of operation, there is good evidence from alcohol that shows that longer hours of sale increase the amount of alcohol consumed and increase the amount of high-risk problematic use and related rates of harms. Most U.S. states that have legalized have gone with 10 p.m. or midnight. Some other Alberta jurisdictions you can see on the screen there. So the general AHS recommendation has been 10 p.m. as a good starting point for consideration. So that's a quick overview of we have the packages here to circulate afterwards, and happy to talk in any more detail. And I'll turn it back over to Michelle for the last piece here.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the resources out there. And so while cannabis use is a personal choice, the low-risk cannabis use guidelines, which parallel the low-risk drinking guidelines, were created to help reduce risks related to cannabis use. And on the next slide, it outlines what lower risk use looks like. And for the sake of time, we'll just sort of go through them. There's a number of guidelines. And the first is cannabis use has health risks, best avoided by abstaining. Delay taking up cannabis use until later in life. Identify and choose lower risk cannabis products. Don't use synthetic cannabinoids. Avoid smoking burnt cannabis. And choose safer ways of using. So, for example, those safer methods of use would be vaporizers or edibles, for example. If you choose to smoke cannabis, avoid harmful smoking practices such as holding your breath or deep inhalation. Limit and reduce how often you use cannabis. Don't use and drive or operate machinery. Avoid cannabis use altogether if you are at risk of a mental health problem or are pregnant. And avoid combining all of the risks mentioned above. And this was developed by CAMH and provides. And it recognizes that people who choose to use are going to use anyhow, and these provide some safer or lower risk methods of using. So overall, and to reduce harms, you want to delay your use, or delay first use, minimize intensity of use, use lower potency products, and use less frequently. Lynn had mentioned that there was also some concerns around the county as a workplace as well. And Alberta Health Services, and this will be in your package, has a manual that was created a few years ago to help employers address substance use in the workplace through policy and HR practices. And it's called It's Our Business, and it's available on the Alberta Health Services website. And I've also in the package brought a handout from this manual that talks about the Fit for Work approach as a bit of an overview of the practice, the HR practices that can be used. Workplace consultation on safety and regulation also wrapped up at the provincial level this March in preparation for spring legislation. So we expect further information for workplaces to come hopefully by June around what that's going to look like provincially, and that's based on my understanding of what I've heard from the province. CCSA has also released this report 2 weeks ago that provides a really nice overview, thank you, of the strengths and gaps around substance use policy in Canada, and can be a really great tool for municipalities to look at. There's also, through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, they've released a document that provides community with guidelines for legalization, and it covers topics that range from land use and business regulation to enforcement and workplace issues. There's also the National Collaboration Centre for Environmental Health. They've put together a new release, Grow at Home resource that outlines a number of policy considerations to limit personal cultivation and production, and addresses things such as indoor air quality, pesticide use, radiation, hash oil production, just to name a few. And this is important because what we've seen in Colorado is about a third of cannabis supply comes from home grows. And highlights issues related to odors, pests, air quality, ventilation, waste disposal, and all those aspects sort of impact municipalities. And it also addresses, what's also important is to address the safe storage of cannabis in homes, particularly to your point about children. So that brings us to the end of what we wanted to cover today. We've asked some questions, but are there any more? Thank you very much for having us attend.
Good for you. Why would they tell you that? No matter what time, when you smoke a cigarette, it's just as bad for you.
And that point relates back, and if I went into more detail, it relates back to brain development in the under 25. And so legalization has established an age limit of 18, but the science states that there can be harm to brain development up to the age of 25. And that also recognizes that the initiation of use for most youth happen under the age of 25. And I don't have the stat in front of me, but 92% of use happens, I think, between the ages of 13 and 24 or something like that. So recognizing that if someone's going to try cannabis for the first time, it's in that age bracket. The reason why that's in that guideline is to delay as long as possible. Just being completely pragmatic and realistic about what's likely going to happen.
But
I think
this is-
it's,
This is ludicrous. I mean,
It's the same as tobacco, though. We know tobacco has negative health effects, and
but it's a long term. Cigarette isn't gonna bother me.
Lung
It
cancer
doesn't-
is pretty long term.
Well, no, but it does, it's not gonna affect the way my brain develops when when I'm 17 years old. But the most at-risk people to use cannabis are the ones, I mean, this is,
I think the sort of the rationale is from a pragmatic perspective, thinking back to the slides on the current use with cannabis being prohibited and the harms that are occurring under the current framework of prohibition. That was part of the rationale for doing that. And setting the age, I think the one way of framing it is around that's the age to start allowing people to have independent decision-making about it, but not necessarily recommending just because it's legal that people are using. Sort of reconciling those two factors, and that, I think also that was part of why the federal government left it to the provinces to decide what to do with an age, and they could increase it, and then those were provincial decisions about, from a policy perspective, was it going to be effective, was it going to make sense? Because the concerns you're raising from an individual and a scientific and a neurodevelopment perspective, medical perspective, do make sense, but then in terms of a policy approach, can we be more effective at the population level in doing that? And I think the argument was maybe not. So we'll see. I mean, and that's the importance Michelle touched on, surveillance and further research. We'll find out, you know, and we need to look at what we're doing now and track that to see going up, is problematic use going up? Are we seeing more harms? What can we do to mitigate that, both from policy and education?
horrible, then how do you, once horses out of the barn, then we'll leave.
So that does come back to what we're recommending in
I
terms of the
understand you guys
regulations.
remain between a rock and a hard place, because at the very most, this should have been decriminalized. But an idiot is a prime minister.
Microphone wasn't on to that.
I know, I can get away with that. But,
Not in
you know, so
this.
we've done something that, I mean, we are, as a municipality, are.
You gotta put this down.
Sorry.
You gotta remember too, in 1919, all right, 1919, you could buy heroin, you could buy cannabis, you could buy, what's the other one? It was all down at your drugstore, you just go in and buy it. So,
But I think really support the idea.
We'll get
of,
back
like
there.
One of our main messages is thinking about health. So, you know, disagreement about the best way in which we can manage this is a health issue for sure. I think every jurisdiction is trying to do what they can and thinking about public health. That's why we're happy to be here and help you guys think about now what is under the municipal. We can work together to achieve what we want to. So, thanks for raising those issues, and you know, we each need to do what we can to try to contribute to that where we're sitting.
I'm just curious, do you know the stats down in Colorado if the usage went up after legalization?
Yeah. Do you want to start and then I
sure.
can add on?
I think what we saw in Colorado is there weren't necessarily more users, but users used more in a very simplistic fashion, if that makes sense, yeah.
But it is a little bit challenging because their framework in which they are operating is different. Canada is going to be unique in being the first country to take this broad approach, and the factors related to what's happening in the neighboring jurisdictions, you know, what the social context is, what social determinants factors are in play, changes some of that as well. So that's, you know, preliminarily, I think we can expect to see some increase, and as on the slide, it looks like people in Canada are potentially, some new users would be going to plan to partake, and some existing users would ramp up, is probably what will happen. But then, you know, there potentially are some gains in terms of reduced harms through criminal justice, especially for youth. I think that's one of the rationale that the federal government was thinking about in the criminal consequences for people that
So just maybe a clarification then, on the one slide, it showed the amount of users with alcohol, marijuana, all the other, had a downward trend. So this can't let that continue. That marijuana would probably spike up to alcohol.
I don't know. I mean, I think it may change the direction of the trend or the slope of the trend. We'll see. I mean, I think the large social acceptability is one of the main things. That's the case with tobacco, right? It wasn't until people were ready for sort of things to move in that direction, and now it's sort of the tobacco end game. You know, what's the next steps from a public health perspective? Cannabis could be different, or it could be similar.
I just think when you've got those bad substances on a downward trend, and society's realizing that, we should stay away from it. It's good for the body and all that to not do it. And if it's on a downward trend, why the hell would you legalize it? Like, that makes no sense whatsoever for me. Like, you're solving the problem. You're letting society solve the problem by themselves. And then you just throw something like that in there? Makes no sense.
I do agree with you, but we did see, like, the alcohol and tobacco were reducing as well, and they are legal.
Yeah.
And then I think, like, as a parent, from that perspective, it's terrifying having this be legalized. And I think, like, our drug task force is working on that message that just because it's legal doesn't mean it's safe. And so that's, like, I think we do need to focus on the education aspect and some of the regulations that, like, the different levels of government are recommending we implement. I think one thing we haven't touched on today that, like, one of the only benefits I can see out of this is at least there is that element of risk because people already are using cannabis, and I know youth are using cannabis, and they don't know what they're using when they're buying illegal cannabis. So the only kind of health potential advantage that I can see is at least these people will know what they're using, and it's not going to be laced with other drugs. So your guy's good. Well, I'm thankful for you.
Any other questions?
I was going to ask Dean to come up and talk a little bit more about the enforcement aspect and how it relates. He's got a little more information in regards to how it relates, maybe to the example of tobacco and cannabis, on what we know so far. So.
One slide, it said that if they make better cannabis, you'll smoke less of it. If they make better whiskey, you drink better whiskey. You don't drink less of it.
Okay, whenever you're ready.
I can't speak to the
Scott.
whiskey, but so through the chair, I just did a little bit of research here regarding the intention under the Alberta Gaming and Liquor Act and how it pertains to the public consumption. So cannabis is going to be covered under two pieces of legislation. One, the Gaming and Liquor Act, which they are looking at amending to the Alberta Gaming and Liquor and Cannabis Act, and then the Smoking Reduction Act as well. So the Smoking Reduction Act will basically outline where you can smoke, and the approach then will be cannabis cannot be used in the same locations where tobacco cannot be used. Unfortunately, that doesn't cover the public areas. That covers, you know, inside bars and restaurants and things like that, and in the workplace. So Bill 26 is also looking at bringing it under the Gaming and Liquor and Cannabis Act, just as it pertains to sales and the regulations that will mirror the liquor regulations. So again, in the research that I've been able to do here, it basically looks like they are not going to cover areas where smoking is allowed. And unfortunately, smoking is allowed in public. So it appears that we really are going to require a municipal bylaw that will cover cannabis use in public. So that's going to fall to Wheatland County to determine if we don't want it in public, like Calgary has done, like Edmonton is doing. That's going to have to fall to us.
As an enforcement officer, are you excited about this change?
No, not particularly. It's a very difficult aspect to enforce. It's just like Mr. Parkin said, you go to a large event, you can smell it, but try to find it. That's the problem. And as you can see, we stand out in the crowd. So enforcement is very difficult in terms of tobacco, let alone cannabis. So that's going to be an issue for us. It's going to take a lot of time away from what we could potentially be doing in a situation where it's a large gathering or special event. What we find during our patrols is what we find during our patrols, but we're not finding a lot of marijuana usage out here. Most of it does happen with, like, inside the home or in the yard. I've only encountered, I think the 4 years I've been here in Wheatland County, I think I've only encountered it twice. So no, I'm not excited about it.
So with that bylaw, we can make our own bylaw, and you can say that no cannabis can be smoked in smoking areas. They have to have their own area. And then just have that 300 feet away from the smoking area in the middle of the field.
Well, and again, through the chair, I can't speak to that. We would have to look at the legalities and what we can and cannot do to restrict it. And again, this is a very new bylaw approach. So I suspect that if we were going to be writing our bylaw, then I would, or we would be doing some extreme research in that, just so we can make sure that we're doing it the right way. I can't speak for Mr. Trudeau, sorry.
I think council would have to be careful or cautious in regards to putting too much legislation around that we can't adequately enforce. You know what I mean? So you may have some powers to do some things, but you may want to be cautious on exercising those powers, because if we're not in a position to adequately enforce that, then what would be the point of doing that, I guess? The same as what the federal government has done now by legalizing it, saying it's not criminal anymore, so that'll free up RCMP officers' time because there's not a criminal code issue. You can, you know, so from that perspective, it does make some sense. And it's not going to tie up the courts because they're going to be taking these, you know, so there's some perspective on that as well. So I just keep that in mind, because I know the tendency would be to, okay, well, let's just ban it everywhere. Well, guess who's going to have to enforce that now? It's gone from this level down to our level.
Any other questions? Thanks.
Thank you.
I guess thinking about the future, when we're going to have to do something fairly soon, I'm thinking. Is staff looking at anything, doing what the city's Calgary's done? We don't want to be.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I guess you were away in February, so we did have some couple meetings with council, and we do have a meeting on May 22nd, and that's one of the items on the agenda.
Okay.
Our staff are continuing to monitor what other jurisdictions are doing. And I think it's been stated a couple times that, you know, there's not all the answers at this point. Provincial government's done a really good job, I believe, and I want to thank the folks coming today to speak, because I think the province has really stepped up to the plate to do what they can. The federal government maybe not so much, but we're in the position we're in, so I think we just have to be cautious on that. So,
okay.
For those that have been monitoring, I guess, the City of Calgary, you saw that there's quite a few people showed up when the first day when they could do permits and things like that. So we have to see how that's going to play out. It may not affect Wheatland County as much as some other jurisdictions as well. We have a smaller market, so there may not be the attraction there that there would be in, say, like a community like Strathmore, as an example, where there's a bigger market. But there will be some operators that probably want to start up, I would suspect. So May 22nd is our next opportunity to talk a little bit more about that and some of the options that we have. So.
Okay, thanks.
One last question. Before, what's burnt marijuana?
Like smoking.
Well, it said up there, don't smoke burnt marijuana. What's burnt marijuana? If it's burnt, there's nothing there.
So what it's getting at is that it's a combustible. So like you would light a cigarette on fire, you would light the product on fire and consume the combustion. It's just a very technical term in terms of,
How
and
do
it's
you
often
smoke it
used.
if you don't light it?
Sometimes, like for example, with shisha, you would heat or combust something else. But it's when the product is heated, for example, with vaping. It's just technical language when you get into the different modes of using with vaping, and it could be in shisha, it could be, it's what you think it is. Like it's lit on fire and then it's inhaled. That's what burnt marijuana is.
Like you said, you're on a grass fire bed in it's a little more
Okay. Okay, well, thanks for the presentation. We appreciate it. Yes. Yeah. Okay, motion to accept his information. Okay, Donna's moved. All in favor? Carried. Anything else we have to deal with? This letter I got here on my desk, you're looking into it, or about a baseball? We don't have to do anything with that, okay? Okay.
Fire in Cheadle, don't send the fire departments.
Okay. Well, if nothing else, we can. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. We'll see you tomorrow at 9 o'clock start.